My grandparents kept a root cellar underneath the farmhouse in Ohio. They fed a family of 7 through every winter without losing a single jar, not one. My grandfather never once opened a can of store-bought vegetables from October through March. Everything came from that cellar: crocks of cabbage, jars of beans, buckets of pickles, and shelves lined with fermented beets that lasted well into spring. He didn't have a refrigerator until 1961. By then, he'd already spent 40 years preserving food the way his father taught him, and his father's father before that. The method worked. It kept people alive through brutal winters on the Great Plains, on small farms in Appalachia, in dense immigrant neighborhoods in Chicago and New York. It worked for 200 years on this continent, and for thousands of years before that on every other continent. Then one generation decided we didn't need it anymore. And then the schools stopped teaching it. That method is lactofermentation. And what I'm going to tell you today is not opinion. This is documented food science, real agricultural history, and the kind of practical knowledge that kept American families fed long before any of us were born. If you want to keep learning things like this, real skills, real history, real food science, subscribe right now and hit that bell. We put out new videos every week, and this is exactly the kind of content we built this channel to share. Let me start with the science, because you need to understand what's actually happening before any of the history makes sense. Every raw vegetable you've ever touched is covered in bacteria. That's not a problem. That's the starting point. One specific family of bacteria lives naturally on the surface of most raw vegetables. They're called lactobacillus. These bacteria have been on plant surfaces for millions of years. They exist there whether you can see them or not. When you create the right conditions, those bacteria go to work. The right conditions are simple. You submerge the vegetable in a saltwater brine, you exclude oxygen. That's it. That's the setup. The lactobacillus bacteria are anaerobic. They don't need oxygen to survive. The pathogens, the harmful bacteria like Listeria and Salmonella, they do need oxygen, or they need a higher pH environment. Salt water with no oxygen is already a tough environment for pathogens. But then the lactobacillus start feeding. These bacteria consume the natural sugars present in the vegetable tissue. As they consume those sugars, they produce lactic acid as a byproduct. That lactic acid begins to lower the pH of the brine. As the pH drops, the environment becomes increasingly hostile to harmful microorganisms. When the pH falls below 4.6, you have created a condition that documented food science recognizes as hostile to most foodborne pathogens. The lactic acid does not run out. The bacteria keep producing it as long as there are sugars to consume. This is why fermented food lasts. It's not preserved by heat like canning. It's not preserved by cold like refrigeration. It's preserved by a living chemical process that the food itself generates. The food becomes its own preservative. My grandfather understood the outcome of this process without knowing the chemistry. He knew that if you packed cabbage in salt and kept it submerged, it would be safe to eat in January. He knew it because his father told him, and because it worked every single time. The science behind why it worked was documented and studied extensively later, but the practice preceded the scientific explanation by 3,000 years. Let me give you the history because this isn't some fringe tradition. This is documented in some of the oldest food records in human civilization. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, appears in Roman records. Roman legions carried it on campaigns. It was food for armies because it lasted. When German settlers came to Pennsylvania and Ohio in the 1700s, they brought the practice with them. It was already embedded in their food culture going back centuries in Central Europe. By the time the American frontier was pushing west, sauerkraut was a staple food on farms across the mid-Atlantic and Midwest states. Kimchi has a documented history spanning at least 3,000 years in Korea. The earliest references to fermented vegetables in Korean records predate modern nation-states by centuries. The practice spread and evolved across the Korean peninsula as a primary food preservation method for populations that had no other reliable way to store vegetables through winter months. This is not folklore. This is documented in historical food scholarship and archaeological records of Korean food culture. The pickle you know from the grocery store today is not the original pickle. The original pickle was a lacto-fermented cucumber. The vinegar-packed cucumber on the shelf at the grocery store is a modern invention designed to mimic the sour flavor of a traditionally fermented pickle. But vinegar pickling is a fundamentally different process. Vinegar pickling is acidification from the outside in. Lactofermentation is acidification generated by the food itself from the inside out. They taste similar. They are not the same thing. The vinegar pickle is dead. The fermented pickle is alive. Here is a piece of American history that a lot of people don't know. When Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out on their expedition in 1804, they carried sauerkraut. This is in the documented historical record of the expedition. They carried it specifically because of its nutritional properties. Sauerkraut is rich in vitamin C, and without fresh fruit and vegetables during long overland travel, scurvy was a genuine threat. British naval records from the same era document that Captain James Cook used sauerkraut on his voyages specifically to prevent scurvy among his crew. Fermented cabbage kept explorers alive. That's not a small thing. So how did something that fed armies and explorers and farm families for 2 centuries just disappear from common knowledge? The answer is not one thing. It's a sequence of things that happened in a compressed period between roughly 1940 and 1980. The first factor is mechanical refrigeration. Household refrigerators existed before World War II, but they were expensive and not universally accessible. By the mid-1950s, the combination of post-war manufacturing capacity, rising household incomes, and rural electrification had made the refrigerator a standard fixture in American kitchens. Refrigeration solved the short-term storage problem mechanically. You no longer needed to ferment vegetables to preserve them through a season. You could buy fresh food weekly and store it cold. The second factor is the industrial food system that expanded dramatically after the war. Large-scale food processing companies found that vinegar pickling was faster, more controllable, and more scalable than lactofermentation. Vinegar pickling could be standardized across enormous production runs. Fermentation could not be rushed or standardized in the same way. It's a biological process dependent on temperature, time, and living organisms. For industrial production, fermentation was a liability. Vinegar was a solution. The industry shifted, and consumer products followed. The third factor is the role of the USDA in shaping home food preservation education. After World War II, the USDA's home economics extension programs, the same programs that had historically taught canning and fermentation skills to farm families, began to emphasize refrigeration and commercially produced canned goods as the primary models for food storage. The educational infrastructure around traditional preservation methods began to shrink. The fourth factor is the collapse of home economics as a serious curriculum in American schools. This happened gradually from the late 1960s through the 1980s. As home economics programs were defunded or absorbed into broader life skills courses, the specific technical content, including food preservation, was the first to go. Schools stopped teaching canning. They stopped teaching fermentation. They stopped teaching the seasonal rhythms of a farm kitchen. Within a single generation, knowledge that had been transmitted for 200 years in this country simply dropped out of the formal educational record. My mother's generation was the last one that learned it at home as a matter of course. My generation had to go looking for it deliberately. Most people younger than me never encountered it at all, unless they had a grandparent who kept old ways. Now let me tell you what the science says about what you lose when you switch from fermented food to vinegar-preserved food or refrigerated fresh food. Because this part matters, and it's backed by documented research. A lacto-fermented food contains live lactobacillus cultures at the time you eat it. These are probiotic bacteria, organisms that, when consumed in adequate quantities, colonize the digestive tract and contribute to what researchers now call the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is the community of microorganisms living in your intestines, and research over the past 2 decades has documented extensive connections between gut microbiome composition and multiple dimensions of human health. The research by Hill and colleagues published in 2014 in the Journal of Gastroenterology established a formal scientific framework for evaluating probiotic claims. The criteria they established, strain identity, safety, adequate dosage, proper storage, are the foundation for how we now evaluate probiotic products. What's relevant here is that lacto-fermented vegetables, when properly prepared and not heat-treated, meet the basic criterion of delivering live cultures. Commercial yogurt with live cultures meets this criterion. The vinegar pickle on the grocery shelf does not. It contains no live organisms. Research on fermented food and digestive health has also intersected with work on FODMAP, fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. These are short-chain carbohydrates that can trigger digestive distress in sensitive individuals. Fermentation partially breaks down some of these compounds in vegetables before they reach your digestive system. This means that some people who have difficulty digesting raw or cooked cabbage can tolerate well-fermented sauerkraut more easily. The biological process of fermentation essentially pre-digests certain components of the vegetable. None of this was hidden, none of this was secret. The science got published, the research got done. But the food industry and the educational system didn't build curriculum around it. And so most people eating vinegar pickles today don't know they're eating something fundamentally different from what a fermented pickle was. Now I'm going to walk you through the actual method. This is how my grandfather did it. This is how I do it. This is how anyone can do it with equipment that costs almost nothing. You start with the brine. The documented science on lacto-fermentation establishes that a 2% salt concentration by weight creates the right environment, high enough to inhibit most pathogens, low enough to support lactobacillus growth. That number is not approximate. It's not a couple of tablespoons per quart. 2% by weight, measured. For every 1,000 grams of water, you use 20 grams of salt. A kitchen scale costs less than $15 and removes all guesswork from this process. The salt matters too. You want non-iodized salt. Iodized salt, the standard table salt with added potassium iodide, can inhibit bacterial activity, including the lactobacillus you're trying to cultivate. Use kosher salt or pickling salt. Both are widely available. Both are inexpensive. The vessel matters. You want something non-reactive. Glass or food-grade ceramic. Wide-mouth mason jars work perfectly. My grandfather used stoneware crocks, heavy 3-gallon and 5-gallon crocks that sat in the root cellar. The crocks are ideal if you can find them, but a mason jar with a standard lid works. You can buy specialized fermentation lids with airlocks for a few dollars, and they're useful because they let CO2 escape without letting oxygen back in. But they're not strictly required. A regular lid loosened slightly will do the same job. Pack your vegetable tightly into the vessel. For cabbage, sauerkraut, you shred it, salt it directly at that 2% ratio by weight, and then massage the salt into the cabbage until it releases its own liquid. That liquid, combined with the cabbage's natural juice, often provides enough brine without adding any water. For other vegetables, cucumbers, carrots, beets, green beans, you pack them in the jar and pour your prepared brine over them. The critical rule is submersion. Every piece of vegetable must stay below the surface of the brine at all times. Anything above the brine surface is exposed to oxygen and to the mold and yeast that can grow in an aerobic environment. You weight the vegetables down. My grandfather used a clean river stone, scrubbed and boiled. You can use a small Ziploc bag filled with brine and placed on top. You can buy glass weights made for this purpose. The method doesn't matter. The vegetable must stay submerged. Then you wait. Room temperature, between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. 3 to 7 days for most vegetables. At 3 days, you have a mild, lightly sour ferment. At 7 days, the flavor is sharper and more complex. My grandfather's sauerkraut sat for 3 weeks in the cold of the root cellar before he considered it ready. Colder temperatures slow the fermentation. Warmer temperatures speed it up. You taste it as it goes and stop when it tastes right to you. What you're looking for during those days, tiny bubbles rising from the vegetable. That's CO2, a byproduct of the fermentation process. That bubbling is confirmation that the lactobacillus are working. You may see the brine become slightly cloudy. That's normal. That cloudiness is live bacterial activity. It's the opposite of a problem. What you want to avoid, any fuzzy growth on the surface. Surface film, a thin white film called COM yeast, is common and not dangerous. You can skim it off. Fuzzy mold in blue, black, green, or pink is a different matter. That means something went wrong. Likely the vegetables weren't fully submerged, or the salt concentration was off. If you see fuzzy mold, discard the batch. Don't try to save it. When the ferment is done, lid it tight and move it to cold storage. A refrigerator slows the fermentation dramatically and holds the product stable for months. A root cellar at 35 to 45 degrees does the same thing. My grandfather's crock sat at around 40 degrees through the winter. He pulled sauerkraut from January through March, and it was perfectly safe every time. I want to tell you about Nana Ruth's root cellar, because this is where everything I've said becomes real to me. Nana Ruth was my grandfather's mother. She was born in 1899 in rural Ohio. She raised 8 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood, on a farm with no running water and no electricity until she was in her 40s. She did not have a refrigerator for the first half of her life. She had a root cellar. That root cellar was dug into the hillside behind the farmhouse. The temperature held between 35 and 50 degrees year-round because of the insulating properties of the surrounding earth. She kept crocks of sauerkraut in there, jars of fermented beans, a barrel of salt pork, shelves of canned tomatoes and corn, bins of potatoes and turnips and carrots packed in sand. She kept meticulous records. She noted in a ledger what she put up each fall, how much she had consumed by February, what ran out, what lasted too long. That ledger is the most practical document I've ever read. It is the operational record of a food system that sustained a large family through decades of hard winters without a single case of foodborne illness that any of the family records mention. Nana Ruth didn't know the word lactobacillus. She didn't know the term pH. She knew the smell of good sauerkraut versus bad. She knew what the brine should look like after 3 days. She knew when to move the crock from the cellar shelf to the kitchen for serving. She had been taught by her mother, who had been taught by her mother. That chain of transmission went back generations and crossed an ocean. When her grandchildren, my parents' generation, got refrigerators in grocery stores, most of them stopped fermenting. There was no practical urgency anymore. The shelf was always stocked. Why spend 3 weeks waiting for cabbage to ferment when you could drive 5 miles and buy a jar of pickles? That's the answer, really. The method didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it became optional. And once it became optional, and once the schools stopped teaching it, and once the grandparents who carried the knowledge started to pass on without transmitting it, it dropped below the threshold of common awareness. One generation of optionality was all it took. And now here we are, and most people under 50 in this country don't know how to ferment a vegetable. They've never done it. They don't know the brine ratio. They don't know what calm yeast is. They don't know why the bubbles matter. They don't know that what's in that grocery store pickle jar is not what their great-grandparents meant when they said pickle. That's the thing that gets me when I think about this. We didn't lose this knowledge because it stopped working. We lost it because we stopped needing it. And then we stopped teaching it. And then we forgot that we'd ever known it. The good news is that you can get it back in an afternoon. You need a kitchen scale, a mason jar, non-iodized salt, and a vegetable. That is the complete equipment list. The bacteria are already on the vegetable. The process is already understood. The science is documented. The history is recorded. My grandfather would have had no patience for the idea that this was complicated or dangerous or mysterious. He would have shown you once, and he would have expected you to do it yourself from then on. That's how it was transmitted for generations. Someone showed you, then you did it. So now I've shown you. The rest is on you. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know we don't put out content for the sake of putting out content. Every video we make is built around real skills, real history, and real science. If that's what you're here for, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we put out next. There's a lot more where this came from, and the next video is going to cover something that connects directly to what we talked about today. Don't miss it. My grandfather kept a root cellar. He fed a family of 7 through winters without losing a single jar. That wasn't luck. That wasn't folk magic. That was a method. A documented, scientifically understood, historically proven method that worked for 200 years and can work for you today. You just needed someone to tell you what it was. Now you know.